So I'll let, well, thanks everyone for being here today. And I'll let Betsy introduce our speaker.
So Joey is an assistant professor in the stats department at Florida, as you may have gleaned from the pre-intro chatting. Joey and I went to grad school together, and his work really runs the gamut from spatial statistics to high dimensional statistics to Bayesian modeling and Bayesian causal inference and more standard causal inference. And I am really excited to hear this particular talk. I assumed when I saw you on the schedule, Joey, that you were going to be talking about something that I was already aware of, but this seems like really new and super interesting work. So I'll let Joey introduce the talk itself.
Well, yeah, thanks. Thanks again, Brian, for the invite, and thanks, Betsy, for the introduction. I'm super happy to be here. There's a bunch of people doing really good work over there, so I'm really excited to get your guys' feedback on this because it is pretty new work, and certainly I'm sure you guys have a lot of interesting things to say about it, and I would love to get that feedback. So, so I'm going to be talking today about first let me give a shout out to my collaborator here, Brendan. So Brendan Beck is a criminologist and a sociologist who works a lot in policing and its effect on society and in the economy. And he unfortunately left me at the University of Florida for the University of Colorado this fall. But he's an awesome guy. And if you're interested in policing, not just the causal side of this work, but the policing side, I definitely recommend taking a look at Brendan's work or listen to some of the podcasts he's been on recently. He's super articulate and just really an awesome guy to talk to about this. So he's been a great collaborator to have, and has led to some really interesting work. So in terms of the talk, I'm not very good, I've found, from dealing with Zoom. So if you want to ask me a question, you can just interrupt me. You don't have to use the chat window. I probably won't see it. So just barge in, and that's totally fine.
I'll monitor the chat, and feel free to try to interrupt, but I'll also monitor the chat and stop you if there's an accumulation of questions.
Perfect. Whatever.
That was a really bad offer.
Okay. All right. I take it back.
No, I'm just kidding.
No. It'll be good. I'm looking forward to it. So, all right. So to get this started, the motivation of this work is a policing initiative called neighborhood policing. So neighborhood policing has been around for decades, but kind of in various forms. There isn't one clear-cut definition of what neighborhood policing means. So New York City, though, has in the last 5 years, Mayor Bill de Blasio made it a big initiative to implement neighborhood policing throughout New York City. And it's pretty well defined in New York City what they mean by neighborhood policing. So neighborhood policing is this idea that every police precinct, so there are 76 police precincts that make up New York City, that every one of them hires 4 new, when they adopt neighborhood policing, they hire 4 new officers who their job is not to go out and make arrests or to walk a beat. It's really just to go out and build up community relationships, build trust between the community and the police that's maybe a bit broken right now. And to maybe, Bill de Blasio says this as a motivating reason, to build informant networks that can eventually lead to solving more violent crimes down the road. And then also the other police officers in that precinct that are not these community-based officers also receive some sort of training on neighborhood policing at the time that it's adopted as well. So we're interested in the effect that this policing initiative has on various outcomes, such as arrest rates. We're obviously interested in whether it actually reduces crime, and one of the main stated goals of it is that it will reduce crime. But we're also, of course, we want to be interested in whether these policies are disproportionately affecting certain precincts or certain communities. As we know that unfortunately some previous policing tactics have, and we want to know to make sure that that's not happening here in this case. Okay, so neighborhood policing in New York City was adopted in this 4-year stretch of time between 2015 and 2018. So a sort of key feature of the data is that every precinct eventually adopts treatment. So it was mandated that they would implement neighborhood policing at some point in time, but it was kind of a loose mandate where everyone could kind of adopt it whenever they felt like it. So there's this weird, the first precincts I think were in May of 2015, if I'm not mistaken, and then they sort of slowly trickle in. They sort of all adopt neighborhood policing at some point in time, and by the end of 2018, all 76 precincts had neighborhood policing, right? So This is called staggered adoption, where there's sort of different time points at which people become treated. And we don't know why certain precincts chose to become treated when they did. They sort of self-selected their treatment time, whether it just be something random or they didn't have time or whatever. We don't really know the process governing that. So here's just an illustration of our data. So we have monthly data, and one feature of our data is we have a lot of pre-treatment data. So we have data going back to 2000, I think, is the first year that we observed data. So these little gray lines are the individual time series for each of the precincts, and the black line is the sort of citywide average. And this is the number of misdemeanors in a precinct per month. Okay, and so these little X's here denote when each precinct adopted the treatment, adopted neighborhood policing. Okay, so we see that it's kind of uniformly scattered from 2015 to 2018. There's no one period of time where sort of everyone adopts or the majority adopt. So you guys are probably familiar with some of this literature, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it because just in the interest of time, and I'm not trying to compare the differences between our approach and some of these. There's certainly some connections to it. Interrupted. So these are methods to estimate causal effects when you have panel data or time series data. So interrupted time series analysis is a sort of classic standard approach. Difference and differences are also, so difference and differences are usually used when you have, classically used when you have 2 time points. So at the first time point, nobody receives treatment, and the second time point, a subset of the individuals receive treatment. But it's been extended recently to this staggered adoption setting in these recent papers that I've cited here in the last couple of years. Synthetic controls are also a useful approach in this time series data, where essentially you try to impute the counterfactual that we would have seen in the absence of treatment by using sort of a weighted average of control time series. And it's also, if you guys are keeping up with the seminar on causal inference, I know that a number of people at Hopkins have participated in it. Eli Ben Michael from Berkeley gave a really nice talk about applying synthetic controls to this staggered adoption setting 2 or 3 weeks ago at that seminar. Work that's kind of most related to what we're going to be doing is this approach from Broderson et al. In 2015. They only had one treated unit, or one unit in their whole data set, where essentially they have a lot of pre-treatment data like we do, and you essentially try to fit a time series model to the pre-treatment data and use it to forecast what would have happened had treatment not been initiated. And you can take the difference between that and what did actually happen, and that gives you the sort of causal effect you're interested in. So here's the notation for the slides. So capital T0 I is just going to be the starting point for precinct I. When did they adopt neighborhood policing? YIT is going to be just our observed outcome for precinct I at time T. So the potential outcomes in this case are not indexed so much by treatment status, because everyone eventually does receive treatment. It's going to be indexed by the time at which you receive treatment. So YIT of T0 here is the potential outcome that we would have observed for a precinct I at time T if they were treated at time T0. Right? And so even though everyone is ultimately treated, we also need this notion of the idea that someone would never get treated, because we're interested in understanding what would happen had this policy not been initiated. So we're going to use this counterfactual YIT of infinity. The infinity kind of denotes that their starting time was infinite. They'd never adopted policy. So this would be the counterfactual we would observe if that precinct never adopted the policy. Okay, so one individual treatment effect that so the next few slides, we're going to talk about various estimands that I'm going to try to estimate down the line, and then we're going to talk some about the assumptions and identification, and then we'll get into the approach. So as a sort of building block to the estimands that I'm actually interested in, we're going to define this individual treatment effect. So this is the effect. So it's denoted by, sorry for the heavy notation here, there's 3 different subscripts for this delta, this effect. So it's the, the effect for precinct I at time T if they initiated treatment at time T0. So it's the difference between what would happen if they initiated treatment at time T0 versus if they had never initiated treatment, right? So let me go here. So this is one of our main estimands of interest now, and I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about this. So we're interested too in whether this causal effect of this neighborhood policing varies with time. So this estimand is indexed by time here. So I'm denoting that with Q. So delta of Q. So Q you can think of as the number of time points after the treatment was initiated. So it goes from 0 up to however many time points we have, after treatment initiation. So 0 would denote the time point that the policy is first implemented, and then 1 would be the next month, and so on and so forth. So what this is it's just a sample average of the individual treatment effects, but at specific time points. And we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So if we look over here at the rightmost part of this equation, it's a sample average of differences between potential outcomes. So for precinct I, what would happen at time t0i plus q if they were treated at time t0i? The difference between that and what would happen at that same point in time for that precinct if they never got treated, okay? And so this first of these two counterfactuals is completely observed, right? And the second of these two is completely unobserved, right? And so this is a little bit not standard, I think, in this estimand, in that we have the random variable capital T0i in the estimand. So this is the actual treatment time that a particular precinct uses or began neighborhood policing at, right? So this is, traditionally we put in sort of fixed values of the treatment, in this case treatment time, into our estimands, but we're going to do this for a couple of reasons. One that we'll talk about later, which has to do with the assumptions that we'll need to estimate this quantity. But it's also, when I was talking with Brendan, this is exactly the question that he wanted to answer. He basically said, we want to know how much neighborhood policing, as it was implemented, affected these different outcomes, arrest rates and crime rates, right? So we want to compare, what happened, given what happened under the policy versus what would have happened had we not initiated this policy whatsoever. So that's directly what this estimand is getting at, is what happened. So this sort of first of these two potential outcomes is sort of what happened at the observed treatment times. And then we want to compare it to what would have happened had we never actually thought about implementing neighborhood policing in New York City. So this is a policy relevant quantity. So you can probably think of other policy relevant quantities that use fixed time points, but we're going to stick with this for the rest of the talk. So those are time specific estimands. So it's the effect of neighborhood policing at a certain amount of time points post treatment initiation, right? But we can also sum these up over various time points and get something like a cumulative impact. So this is, we're not going to talk that much about this estimand. It essentially is just the sum of the previous estimand over some number of time points. So, but it gives us a good measure of sort of the total impact that neighborhood policing has after some period of time, right? Maybe after the first year of neighborhood policing, we can take a look and see roughly how much crime or arrest rates changed. Okay, so moving along. So those are sort of marginal or sort of average treatment effects that kind of denote the sort of global impact of this policy in New York City, right? We're sort of averaging over all the different precincts and their effects. But we're also interested, I told you at the beginning, that we're interested in understanding whether sort of neighborhood policing affects certain communities more than others, right? And so this is kind of hinting at treatment effect heterogeneity. We want to understand whether these individual treatment effects sort of vary by characteristics of the communities at which neighborhood policing is implemented. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of posit a model for these individual treatment effects. So we're going to suppose that these individual treatment effects for a particular precinct at a particular point in time are some function of so X here are precinct level covariates, denoting sort of characteristics of the community that we have from census and other data sources. So we can also include time in here, but mostly what this is going to be aimed at getting at is how these different precinct level characteristics affect the treatment effect, okay? And so F, I think, is an estimand of interest in its own right. For those of you that work in treatment effect heterogeneity, you're interested in estimating the CATE, the sort of average treatment effect as a function of covariates. This is very similar to that notion. Okay, so it'll be interesting to look at this F function on its own, but we're also going to come up with, and there are many such ones that you could come up with. This is just one that we thought of, an estimand that we wanted something that targets the effect of one particular covariate on the treatment effects. We want to know, does socioeconomic status affect the manner in which neighborhood policing affects a community, right? So don't worry about all the notation on this slide. I'll sort of walk through it. It's sort of just the difference in the treatment effect. So F is the treatment effect for a particular covariate and time combination. It's just the difference in that treatment effect where if you fix all covariates except for covariate J at their observed values that we observe in the data, but then you fix covariate J to some value xj, and then compare it to some other value xj prime. So if we change socioeconomic status from maybe the first quartile to the the 25th quantile or the 75th quantile, how does that affect the treatment effect?
Interrupt with a question.
Sure thing.
So why are you thinking of it this way instead of just making it a function only of the particular covariate you're interested in?
You could also, it's an interesting point. You could also do that, completely do that. So, and in fact, it kind of goes back to this F function here. If I wanted to just evaluate, does, the treatment effect vary with one particular variable, I could also just posit a model for the treatment effect and see how it relates to one covariate. So just include like one covariate in here and then estimate this F function, and it'll tell me exactly sort of everything I want to know about how that one covariate relates. I think the way we did it this way, where we sort of have all the covariates, it's sort of, there might be, what's the best way of saying it? Is somebody trying to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say something. That was my wife, but I want to have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
But you want to finish your thought?
You can go ahead if it's related to the thought. It's.
Well, I'm a little confused about time here, in the sense that, don't we know that crime rates are higher in the summer?
Yes.
And so is that, how does that factor in here? Is that just taken care of?
So I think that's going to fact. Good.
Because if you go back to your previous slide, right, you're saying the individual treatment effect at time t. I'm just trying to understand the idea of time here, and sure. Because if you implement the policy right in March, and looking at 3 months late, 3 or 4 months later, then you're hitting the summer season.
But
so can you speak a little?
T0, so that's included, right? That's incorporated by the fact that the effect can depend on T0 and Q.
Yeah, I think that there are sort of two aspects to your question about how sort of seasonality plays a role in this, right? And so, I think that if you think that there's two different issues, one is at this point with the treatment effect function, we could let that be a function of, what time of the year it is, right? So we could include that into these covariates X. If we think the treatment effect will be different during certain seasons, we could incorporate that into this function. We are going to talk a little bit about seasonality in terms of not just with respect to this, that also affects the aggregate or the sample average treatment effects that we had before, because you can imagine, like you're saying, it's like, well, if we implement the policy in March or April, but then the summer comes and crime just goes up anyways, but it may not be due to the policy, but I think you might be thinking that we might be mistakenly attributing it to the policy. We're going to deal with that, but that's something that we're going to talk about later through the sort of identification and estimation side of things. And so, Betsy, to finish your question, I think we want to do it this way because we wanted to incorporate the fact that there might be sort of interactions in this function F between all the different covariates, right? And looking at one function looking at just one covariate at a time might not be representative of everything that's going on. And so we kind of wanted to do it sort of incorporates all the covariates simultaneously. But I think that what you said makes total sense, and I think we could come up with estimands that would be interesting to look at that really just evaluate one covariate at a time and not in this way.
Elizabeth also asked in the chat about whether it's a well-defined counterfactual if you think about isolating one community indicator from, like SES, for example, can that really be disentangled from the other covariates? And can you imagine, but it's not, you're not intervening on the covariates, you're just looking at how the function varies.
Yeah.
So let me see if that covers Elizabeth's question. Does it make sense to imagine changing SES but none of the other community indicators? Yeah, you're not changing those covariates. You're just looking at how the treatment effect varies with them. So that would.
I do think that it raises an interesting point, though, and that I still think there might be an issue here where it's like, yeah, maybe I fix socioeconomic status, but there might be other variables that, there aren't really communities communities that have low socioeconomic status tend to have certain other community characteristics. And if I just say, well, what if I force this to be the 75th quantile of socioeconomic status? That's not really a realistic community to look at because it doesn't exist. And so you could alternatively come up with other estimands, I think, that sort of just look at different covariate profiles altogether. So, maybe you have one set of covariate profiles, you can maybe even cluster them somehow and see how the treatment effect varies across these different realistic values of what community precinct or community characteristics could take.
Yeah, so the issue would be like collinearity in the covariates, but which actually I do think points towards your method of looking at all the covariates simultaneously, because you can then possibly tease that out before you go to interpret the marginalization over everything except for SES.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. Great. So I'll get started unless we have any others, but again, feel free to just interrupt. So now let's get to some of the assumptions that we're going to talk about. So the first is just consistency. So this is pretty standard. This is just the potential outcome that we observe. So YIT is equal to, the observed data, YIT is equal to the potential outcome under the observed treatment time, right? So this is what allows us to say that this first quantity of these two quantities is observed, right? That this counterfactual under the observed treatment time, that is an observed quantity because it's just our observed data. The second one is the no interference assumption, which is maybe the biggest leap that I'm going to be taking here. So this is saying that the time series for a particular precinct is not affected by the neighborhood policing status of different precincts. And so we have to think about whether that's a reasonable assumption in our case or not. And so I've had some long discussions with Brendan about this, and he seems to think it's somewhat reasonable. So I was a little bit worried about this because there's been some recent work done in the interference literature of causal inference that looks at policing as an outcome. But generally those things, at least the ones that I've seen, look at hotspots policing as a treatment, where they sort of throw all these police officers into one area, and then the worry is that it'll displace crime. So there's this interference or this spillover. So in our case, we have to think about how it might manifest itself. So officers, these 4 officers are hired to go into that precinct and only in that precinct and sort of try to build up relationships with the community. And it's not clear how that will lead to changes in the time series of neighboring precincts. I think one way that interference could occur is possibly if I'm in a precinct that doesn't have neighborhood policing and I'm a police officer, but I know that the next door precinct has adopted this neighborhood policing, maybe subconsciously that it kind of affects my behavior in some way, that I know that other precincts around me are changing this behavior in some way, and maybe that we should be changing ours. But we're going to assume that away for now. And then there's the no anticipatory effects assumption. So this intuitively just says that units don't respond to the treatment before it occurs, so they don't sort of know that it's about to happen, that neighborhood policing is about to occur, and then change their behavior. So in notation, that's just saying that the potential outcome had this at a particular time, had you never been treated, is the same as the potential outcome at that point in time if you get treated later, right? So it's the same thing. So there's no anticipation that a treatment is coming, and then therefore the behavior has changed. Okay, so I'll talk briefly now about identification, which may seem a little weird because so far what I've presented to you are, especially those aggregate estimands, are sort of their sample treatment effect. They're not population level treatment effects, and identification formulas are usually restricted to population level treatment effects, and generally sample average treatment effects are not sort of identified in that way. And it's also a little bit hard, I think, in our motivating example to think of something like a superpopulation of New York City precincts, right? I mean, New York City has 76 precincts. That is fixed, and I can imagine that will change sometime in the future, but it's going to remain some small number of precincts that make up New York City. But I still think that it's interesting to look at a sort of population level, like a corresponding population level estimand to the one that we're looking at, because it sort of builds insight into the assumptions that we need to estimate causal effects well. And so we're going to look at identification of a population level estimand to give us some more insight into assumptions that we need. So I'm going to use this particular population version of our estimand. So when I say our estimand, I'm referring to delta Q here. So that's the causal effect at a particular point in time, the average causal effect across New York City at a particular point in time. And so what I'm going to look at is the difference in potential outcomes at time t0 plus q. If you were treated q time points earlier at times t0, the difference between that and the potential outcome had you never been treated. But to make it analogous to our sample average treatment effect, I'm going to condition on t0 being equal to little t0. And the reason we do that is because in our sample average treatment effect, we're essentially conditioning on t0. We're using the observed values of t0. And so we're sort of just looking at the effect at the time that you actually observe treatment. And so that's essentially what this estimand is looking at. It's looking at the causal effect at time t0, but only among subjects that actually receive treatment at time t0. And so what we showed is that this estimand is under those three assumptions of consistency, no interference, and no anticipatory effects, you get that identification relies on these quantities. So this is the potential distribution of the potential outcome under never receiving treatment at time t0 plus 1, given the previous time. And you sort of have a series of successive conditional distributions going up to the time point that you are interested in estimating all the way up to time q. Okay. Now, the important thing to note is that these are unobserved quantities. So because these are counterfactuals in the absence of treatment, right? That's what these infinities are denoting, right? But we're looking at times after treatment initiation, right? So we don't observe that data. So we can't, these are unknown quantities. So how do we estimate them from the data? Well, to estimate them from the data, we need to estimate this conditional distribution of the counterfactual outcome given the previous time using the pre-treatment data. All right, so we're going to use the data from pre-treatment when we do observe the counterfactual in the absence of treatment to learn these conditional distributions and then hope that they apply into the future. So this is a stationarity assumption on the time series, that the model that we learn in the pre-treatment data applies into the remaining time points that we're trying to forecast into. So our method, I haven't talked about it yet, is going to be trying to forecast into the future what happens in the absence of treatment. And we need these distributions to remain constant, right? If the time series in the absence of treatment changes fundamentally after treatment initiation, then I can't hope to identify the treatment effect. So I need it to be stationary.
Maybe you'll get to this, but are you going to test whether stationarity is reasonable for the data, given that you have staggered adoption? Okay.
Yeah, so we're going to use the pre-treatment data to try to figure that out. Or to get, we can never know for sure, of course, because this assumption goes into the unknown stuff, but we can get some idea into whether this is holding in our data set.
And presumably, like, I would think one of the biggest risks would be a like citywide shock. But since you have staggered adoption, you would have some areas that are still pre-treatment where you could test that, see whether there's evidence for that.
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that's probably the biggest problem to us, is just some shock to the system that occurs after treatment that we couldn't possibly hope to capture in our models, right? And whether we have the staggered adoption setting or not, that is a problem. It just it's maybe less of a problem in staggered adoption because maybe it'll only affect, a subset of the precincts that we're trying to estimate. But it would still be a problem nonetheless.
Oh no, I was thinking that you probably have untreated data from most time. I guess, I mean, for the window during which there's adoption, you have continual pre-treatment data from some precincts. So you can see if stationarity seems to hold through 2018 for at least in terms of a citywide shock. You would be able to detect that from the pre-treatment data that continues in some.
Yes, I think that's right. Yeah. Okay, so one thing that to finish up the identification, you might see is that we don't have an unmeasured confounding assumption. We have an arguably very strong assumption in its own right with stationarity, but we don't have your sort of standard no unmeasured confounding assumption in this case. And typically that assumption is used to sort of, let's say I want to impute the counterfactuals for, say, a control group, but using data from a treated group. We're trying to sort of transport inferences from one group to another, but we're not doing that in this case. So everyone's treated in this case, and we're only looking at the sort of observed treatment times for each of the precincts. We're not trying to transport inferences to some other hypothetical time that they could have initiated treatment. So we don't need that assumption in this case. And so you might be asking, what are the covariates useful for then? So, in the previous slide, I wasn't conditioning on covariates, but I could be. What it does is covariates will increase precision. Obviously, if they're associated with the outcome, it'll help to adjust for them. But it also, you can kind of imagine, and this is kind of hard to get my head around, this is something that I still have trouble thinking about, is, you know, the stationarity assumption might be more plausible if you adjust for some covariates, right? If you have some time varying variables that you're not adjusting for, you can still have stationarity, but maybe it makes it more plausible if you adjust for them. Okay, so now let's get to the estimation strategies. See how I'm doing on time. Okay, so what we're trying to do is we have this sort of spatiotemporal data set, right? We have spatial data, and the data are sort of possibly correlated across space. So in this plot here, you know, you can kind of see that there is some sort of spatial relationship. This is, I think, I plotted misdemeanor arrest rates across New York City, averaged across the entire time period. There's strong temporal correlation as well in the data, which I think is somewhat intuitive. The data set is somewhat high dimensional. So, you know, we have 76 precincts, so we have 76 time series and only 156 time points at which we want to estimate these quantities, these time series. So it's sort of kind of getting close to what people in time series would call high dimensional, and so we're going to have to use some of those high dimensional time series techniques in our estimation procedure. And we also want to allow, of course, for estimating heterogeneous treatment effects. So I'm going to go into the details of it in the next 5 slides or so, but if you only take away what's on this slide, then that's good, because this is just an overview of the approach, and the next few slides are just about how we actually modeled this data. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the pre-treatment data and we're going to build a model for this outcome, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to use that model to then predict what would have happened in the absence of treatment, right? So if there had been no neighborhood policing, what would have happened in those time periods where neighborhood policing was actually implemented, right? And so what we're going to do then is we're just going to compare the difference between what actually happened under treatment, right? And then compare it to what we estimate would have happened had there been no treatment, no neighborhood policing. All right, so we're going to do this all within the Bayesian paradigm. So we're going to get a posterior distribution of these treatment effects. And what we're going to be able to do is, what's going to be nice about doing things in the Bayesian paradigm here is that then investigating further whether these treatment effects are heterogeneous or not, we'll be able to account for the uncertainty in those estimates quite naturally. Okay, so I think it's somewhat intuitive. It's not that difficult. We're just trying to predict what would have happened had there been no treatment using the time series before treatment started, and then compare it with what actually happened, right? So we're going to fit this spatiotemporal model to the data, and I should say that, you know, there's nothing special about this model. This is just the model that I got to get working. If you have other spatiotemporal models that you're interested in applying, they would apply directly. So we're assuming that this is a vector autoregressive model. For those of you that are familiar with that, we're saying that the outcome at a particular time t, so the entire, this is a vector of outcomes for all the precincts, is equal to some function of time or some other mean function. You can include covariates in there as well. And this is a subject-specific effect, so you get subject-specific time slopes and trends and intercepts. But then you have this autoregressive component where we're taking the observed data at the previous time point minus the mean function at that time point. And so we're going to let the residuals at the past time point inform the current time point. So this is a vector autoregressive model of order 1. And so this A matrix here is what dictates the amount of temporal dependence, both across precincts and within a precinct. So A is this n by n matrix that sort of determines how residuals from the set of precincts at the previous time point affect the outcomes at the current time point. Okay, so we have to estimate this A. This is an unknown matrix of parameters that sort of guides the temporal dependence. And it's extremely important, I found, that you get the temporal dependence pretty well here, or else you tend to get incorrect inferences, right? There's a strong temporal dependence here, and it's important to get it correctly. We also allow for contemporaneous spatial correlation. So spatial correlation at a particular point in time among all the precincts. We think there might be correlation across precincts. And that's cut into our residuals epsilon. So we assume that epsilon follow a multivariate normal distribution with covariance matrix given by sigma. But sigma dictates the amount of correlation sort of across precincts at a given point in time.
Could you explain like where the correlation might be coming from if there's no interference?
Yeah, this is a great question. So I think you can have spatial correlation without having interference, right? So you can imagine maybe some underlying unmeasured covariate that is spatially correlated across the population that affects the outcome, right? That induces spatial correlation in your outcomes by not accounting for it. But that has nothing to do with, so interference would say that, the treatment status of somebody else affects my outcome, right? But that cannot occur, that can be absent and still have spatial correlation among the outcomes just due to some underlying sort of spatial variation in the data.
So it's like it's some unmeasured factor that has its own spatial dependence structure.
Yeah, I think that's the easiest way that I have for thinking of it. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, so this problem does get too high dimensional though. If we just proceeded with inference as usual, if we just said, all right, you know what, I'm going to estimate A, I'm going to estimate the covariance matrix sigma, I would run into major problems with overfitting, and I think it would be truly high dimensional that the number of parameters is more than our data points. Because A has n squared parameters, and we have n is 76 in our case, so you're looking at like 5,000 parameters in A. The covariance matrix has, a similar order of parameters, right? Something on n squared order number of parameters for the covariance matrix, and we have to reduce the dimension of this problem somehow when we estimate this model. So, there are some techniques in the literature for how to reduce the dimension of this in data adaptive ways, or using sort of shrinkage priors or spike and slab priors, or just any kind of high dimensional prior that's used for high dimensional Bayesian models. Or low rank structures on these. You can put a low rank structure on A and sigma as well. What we're going to do though is we have a known spatial structure to our data set, right? We know who are neighbors with who, and we sort of know who we think will be more correlated with who given this sort of spatial structure. So we're going to reduce the dimension using that first. So first, for the reducing dimension of A, which governs the temporal dependence, we're going to assume that any element of A, so the ij element of J, is equal to 0 unless those two precincts are touching each other. If they're neighbors, then we allow their corresponding A elements to be non-zero. But if they're not neighbors, then we force it to be 0. And this induces a lot of sparsity in this matrix because most precincts in New York City have anywhere from 1 to 2 to 5, 6 neighbors, right? They don't. So you've reduced the number of non-zero elements in each row of this matrix from 76 to, say, 5. Okay? So this is restricting that this temporal dependence is restricted to both yourself and your neighboring time series. We're going to use a similar strategy for sigma. So what we're going to actually look at is the inverse of sigma. So we're going to call omega the precision matrix. So this is just the inverse of our covariance matrix. And one really nice result about precision matrices is that if the ij element is equal to 0 of this precision matrix, that implies that those two precincts I and j, are conditionally independent of each other given all of the other precincts, right? So we might think that maybe everything is marginally correlated with each other, but two precincts are likely to be conditionally dependent only if they're neighbors, right? We're going to assume that they're conditionally independent if they're farther away than first order neighbors. And we could relax this to include second order neighbors or some other form of spatial structure if we wanted, but we're going to use neighbors for now. So what we're going to do is we're going to force all elements of this covariance matrix to be equal to 0 for any precincts that are not neighbors, right? So we're just going to allow dependence, but only among the neighbors, right? So we're going to enforce this sparsity every time we estimate sigma. Okay, so we're almost there to get to the interesting stuff and the data application. So what we're going to do is we're going to estimate that model, like I said, in the Bayesian framework. And what that's going to give you is, so that model is fit to the pre-treatment data. So it's essentially modeling y infinity, right? It's modeling the data in the absence of treatment. And what you're going to do is you're going to get a posterior distribution of these outcomes for the future time points where we actually observe treatment, but we're trying to predict what would have happened in the absence of treatment. So for any time point that we're trying to predict what would have happened in the absence of treatment, we're going to get the posterior distribution of that quantity from this model. Okay? But once we have that quantity, we have everything we need, right? Because the treatment effects themselves, the individual precinct level treatment effects, are just the difference between the observed data, which is under treatment, so what happened under treatment, and this estimate, right? So the observed data is fully known. The uncertainty only comes from these forecasts into the future that we have from our model. And so our posterior distribution of our individual causal effects is just the observed data in the presence of treatment minus, we have this posterior on what would have happened in the absence of treatment. Okay? And so we account for that uncertainty through this posterior distribution up here. So from that, once we get that posterior distribution of delta, we automatically have the marginal estimands that we were talking about at the beginning, right? We have these like delta Q and the cumulative estimates. Those are strictly functions of delta. And so once we have the posterior distribution of all the individual deltas, we're off and running, right? We can do inference very easily. The less obvious thing is how to deal with the heterogeneous treatment effects, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, all right, so we want to estimate this F function, which is what relates the individual treatment effects to the community level characteristics. What we're going to do is we're going to take for every posterior sample that we have. So we're going to do this for every posterior sample. So I'm going to denote the posterior sample that I'm at by delta B. Right? This is the B posterior sample of the individual treatment effects. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to regress those individual treatment effects on all the characteristics that I'm interested in understanding heterogeneity for. So the precinct level characteristics and maybe time if I want to include those as well. And I can do this in sort of any way that I want. Well, maybe not any way that I want, but there's a wide range of models that I could use for this. Linear regression would work, and it's very fast, right? I'm doing this for every posterior sample, so I don't want it to take too long because I have to do it a bunch of times. I'm doing it for every posterior sample. But you can think of other nonlinear models. I use random forests in the results that you'll see later, seem to work pretty well as well. So you can sort of embed more flexible models into this aspect to estimate that F function in a sort of nonlinear and flexible way. But once we do this, so for every posterior draw, we do this regression, and then we get an estimate of F, right? We get an idea of what this function looks like. So now we have posterior draws of this heterogeneous treatment effect function, and any estimand that we're interested in that relates to heterogeneous treatment effects, we can get automatically from these posterior samples. Okay? Which is sort of the main reason why we fit this model within the Bayesian paradigm. All right, so now I think this is going to get to, I think, my favorite part of the talk. So Brian, feel free to let me know if I'm running short on time, but this part should go a little bit quicker. So just, so first we're going to talk about, kind of hint at the stuff that Betsy was talking about with trying to validate our model assumptions, and then we're going to actually analyze the real data. So first, I'm going to talk about this sort of simulation-based approach to validating our model. So of course, we all use simulation in all of our papers, right? And of course, they always work well because I'm the one who generates the data. So of course, my approach works well, right? I'm certainly guilty of that in other papers that I've written, I'm sure, whether consciously or subconsciously. But what's nice about having this time series data is that you can use the pre-treatment data to try kind of evaluate how well you can actually do at estimating causal effects without generating the data in a way that is amenable to your model, right? In a way that is sort of not governed by you, it's just governed by the actual data itself. All right, so our approach has these, we're relying on this model being correctly specified and stationarity of our time series. And these are big assumptions. And I wouldn't want to just analyze the data and just hope that they worked, right? I want some way of confirming that in this data, I can actually get reasonable estimates of the quantities I'm interested in. So we're going to try to empirically validate that with New York City data. In particular, so we're going to use this form of simulation. So essentially, we're going to run a simulation study type of approach, but we're not going to be generating any data, right? So here's like a little visual illustration of what we're going to be doing, and I'll try to walk through it. So of course, we're only going to be restricting attention to pre-treatment data. We don't want to be looking at any of the data after the treatment is initiated, right? But what we're going to do is, so we have the observed starting time for every precinct, but I'm just going to randomly assign a new one that is earlier, right? Some earlier time point, right? That's maybe not too far in the past, but some point in the past, right? And so in this little visual illustration, I have the observed data starts at time, the actual treatment time is time 70. So that's where that vertical black line is. But I'm just going to say, oh, you know what, in this case, I'm just going to assume incorrectly, but I'm just going to pretend that the treatment started at time 48 here, right? And the reason why I do this is because for all the time between time 48 and time 70, I know what the counterfactual in the absence of treatment is, right? That's just the observed data. That's just this black line. Well, I can't highlight it, but it's just that black line, right? So that's the counterfactual that we're usually trying to forecast, that we usually don't have. But now we do have it, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shift that line to be my observed data under treatment. So the red line will be my observed data under treatment, and that's going to be sort of the data that I'll actually evaluate the causal effect on. But the shift between the black line and the red line is the true causal effect, right? And I can make it as complicated as I want. So right here, what you have is just a sort of constant shift upwards, just for illustration. But I could have, it could vary with time. It could vary by precinct characteristics, right? And so we're going to do this for every precinct. We're going to pick a random start time in the past, and then we're going to shift the data after that time point. And that'll be the causal effect, right? But in this case, we know what the true counterfactual is in the absence of treatment, and we know the true causal effect. So essentially, we know the ground truth, if you will, right? We know the quantity that we're trying to estimate what it is, right? But we didn't control the data generating process, right? I didn't generate the outcome at all. I'm just using the observed New York City data that I'm interested in estimating just in the pre-treatment time. I'm using that as my simulation data, right? So in this data, it's very possible that stationarity or various other modeling assumptions that I've made will not hold, right? So what we're going to do is we'll do this a large number of times. So for each precinct, you randomly assign a new starting point. You do this for each precinct, all right? And then you take that data and you fit our approach and see what happens, right? And this is not unique to our approach, right? Any sort of panel, and I'm not claiming to be the first one to do this. I've seen this done before, but it's a really nice way of validating how your approach does on a data that more closely, that really resembles your actual data, because it is your actual data. It's just in a slightly earlier time period. So I'll just briefly show a couple results. So it's sort of unique to the outcome that you're looking at. So one outcome that we're going to look at is proactive arrests, right? So I want to evaluate whether these assumptions that I have work for proactive arrests, whether they give good results for this particular outcome. So what I did is, so the left plot here shows essentially, these are the time-specific causal estimates. So that's the delta Q. What I did is I plotted my estimates, again, minus the true value. So you want this to be centered around 0, which would indicate unbiased estimates. What we see is that we get relatively unbiased estimates as you get to later time points. So like times 7, 8, 9, you start to see a little bit of bias creeping in, but it's not substantial. Obviously, the farther into the future that I predict, the uncertainty is growing. So you see the sort of widths of these intervals is growing over time. So this approach is really more useful for short-term causal effects estimating. So what happens in the time points closest to the treatment initiation, because it gets harder and harder to forecast into the future. What I was really happy with and quite surprised with was the coverage of these estimates, because this also relies on whether I account for the uncertainty inherent in the data correctly, the temporal and the spatial uncertainty. So at each time point, I'm plotting the coverage, I'm aiming for 95% coverage, and I'm getting pretty close to 95% coverage. It starts to drop a little below 95% in later time points, but it's still pretty close to the nominal level. These were for average treatment effects. What about heterogeneous treatment effects? So I can input, I can shift the data in a way that's unique to each precinct and see how well I can estimate that. And those are more problematic, we found in this data set. So when we look at heterogeneous treatment effect estimates, we tend to get lower coverage for a couple of the covariates here. So if you look at the left panel here first, you see that covariates 5 and 8 have fairly low coverage. I would say unacceptably low coverage. Maybe the other covariates are a little bit more reasonable, but those two are not good, right? And what seems to be happening is that the farther into the future you predict, it gets harder. And you're bound to hit a precinct where you do a bad job estimating it. And there's a lot of bias in that one particular precinct's estimate. And if that precinct also has a kind of extreme value of that covariate, then you can get really kind of crazy results for the heterogeneous treatment effects, right? And so what we found is that we do much better for the heterogeneous treatment effects if we look less far into the future. So I could look as far into the future as I wanted, but if I only restrict to, so the right plot here is if I only restrict to looking at the estimates for 3 time points out into the future and try to see whether those are heterogeneous with respect to the community characteristics, I do much better in terms of coverage. So all of the covariates kind of pop up to 95%. The 2 problematic covariates, 5 and 8, don't pop up all the way to 95%, but they pop up to a much more digestible level than what we saw previously, right? But I think this is clear, is that what the simulation is telling us is that we seem to do well with the aggregate estimates, but we're going to struggle a little bit more with the heterogeneous treatment effect estimates, and maybe we should be a little bit more cautious interpreting them on our real data set. Okay, So now let's get to the actual data analysis. So we're interested in the effect of neighborhood policing on 3 different outcomes we're going to look at. So there's proactive arrest. So this is a really interesting one because it's one that we really thought could be affected by neighborhood policing. So a proactive arrest, something like loitering or a low-level marijuana offense, something that, it's more likely if a cop is out looking for it, they're trying to make an arrest, they're more likely to arrest people for it. It's not like, they see a big crime happen on the street and they have to respond to it. It's something that's more discretionary, right? That they sort of, if cops are out looking for it because they need to meet arrest quotas or something of that nature, whether that actually exists, I don't know. But, this is kind of up to, there's a lot of discretion on the police part, whether they make these arrests, right? And so we're interested in, because neighborhood policing as a policy de-emphasizes arrest rates as a measure of police quality, right? Instead of measuring how good our police are doing by measuring how many arrests they made, sort of de-emphasizes that. And so we thought it might affect proactive arrests. But we were also worried that just because you have 4 additional police officers outside, that maybe it'll increase the number of arrests just because they're outside. If they see something, then they have to respond to it. We're also interested in crime. So crime rate is notoriously hard to measure, Brendan tells me, but violent crime is apparently a very robust measure of crime because people tend to report violent crimes sort of regardless of the situation. So we're going to keep track of violent crimes to see if neighborhood policing actually reduces them. So the mayor made this big claim that it was going to reduce violent crimes and help solve crimes. And we want to evaluate whether that's happening. And then lastly, we're going to look at a measure of disparity in proactive arrest rates. So we're going to look at a ratio of Black arrest rates to white arrest rates in a particular precinct and see whether that's affected by neighborhood policing as well. So we have a number of modifying covariates that we're interested in understanding whether these effects vary by, and you'll see all of them in a second, but they cover a number of demographic and socioeconomic variables regarding the precinct that we're looking at. So first, the proactive arrest is, I think, the most interesting outcome where we actually really saw some interesting things. So what we see, so this plot here shows that the treatment effect is negative and significant, at least for the first 5 time points after treatment initiation. And then you still seem to see a negative treatment effect, but the uncertainty intervals get wider and wider as the farther you forecast in the future. But it seems like proactive arrests are being reduced by neighborhood policing, and this kind of gets at that mechanism that I was just talking about, where they're de-emphasizing arrests as a measure, as an outcome measure to judge police by. And so it's somewhat intuitive that we would expect this treatment to reduce arrest rates if they're de-emphasizing making arrests. And so it seems to be doing that. So on the left, I have the time-specific treatment effects, and then the right is the cumulative estimates. So of course, the cumulative estimates are getting bigger and bigger because it's summing up the effect estimates from the left plot. But we see there seems to be a real effect on proactive arrests, and we feel good about this finding given that the sort of model checking that we did with that simulation on the pre-treatment data seems to show that we get good inferential properties for proactive arrests for these aggregate estimates. So violent crimes show a different story. There doesn't appear to be really any effect of neighborhood policing on violent crimes. So this kind of disagrees with or goes against what the mayor was saying when he proposed this initiative, that the idea was that, I believe, was that neighborhood policing was intended to create informant networks, which would lead to solving of more crime and reducing crime overall in the city. Now, to be fair, we are only looking at 10 months after treatment initiation. It's quite possible that this mechanism just takes longer to take effect, right? Something like an informant network to reduce crime is going to take some time, right? It's not going to happen instantly. And so it's very possible that there's just a longer time lag by which we need to see to evaluate whether violent crimes are affected by neighborhood policing. But at least what we see in roughly the first year of the data after treatment initiation, there appears to be no effect on violent crimes. And if anything, it just goes up a little bit, though I wouldn't read into that in any way. Lastly is the sort of racial disparity measure that we looked at. So we looked at the ratio of Black arrest rates to white arrest rates. And what we found is very similar to the violent crime, was that their neighborhood policing seems to have basically no effect on this ratio. Now, I want to be clear that this doesn't mean that there is not a disparity in arrest rates. It just means that neighborhood policing is not affecting that disparity, right? Whatever disparity existed before neighborhood policing seems to be persisting into the time points after neighborhood policing is implemented.
These null results, like the last two ones you showed, are some of the values in the confidence interval consistent with there being an effect, or are these values like not, like if it was like on the left one, if the effect was like 0.2 or something, would that be a large effect or
I see.
not?
That's a great question. I don't know as well for this one, because I'd have to think about how that disparity measure is calculated a little bit harder. It's a little bit harder because it's a ratio of a ratio. It's kind of nothing new. This one, the violent crimes, is a little bit easier to interpret because it is the number of crimes reported in that on average in a precinct per month, right? So
this is literally like plus or
One crime.
minus one
it's
crime.
pretty small.
Okay.
And so in terms of I'm glad you bring this up, because in terms of, it's important that I should have mentioned that on this one as well, is that this is a reduction in 10, meaning 10 less arrests per precinct per month. That's what the interpretation of this is, right? Which I think is a somewhat substantial change in arrest rates, right? But in crime, you're right. This is a very, very small, right? Even if it was significant, if we had a massive data set or something and we managed to get a significant effect here, it would be, while maybe statistically significant, not actually all that meaningful. Okay. And I also think when I think about this measure, I think some of the numbers for this racial disparity measure are in the order of like 10s to 50. So I think a change of 0.2 is not substantial, I will say. But I'd have to think a little bit harder about that one to be sure. So overall, at the aggregate level, we don't see an effect on violent crimes or racial disparities. Now, the reason we look at heterogeneous treatment effects is obviously we're interested in them, but also it could be because sort of homogeneous effects or aggregate effects may mask something that's going on, right? Maybe some communities are experiencing an increase in crime, and some communities are seeing a decrease in crime. And if you were just looking at an aggregate measure, they would sort of cancel out and you wouldn't see much. But maybe you would see something when you look at the heterogeneous treatment effect functions. But what we see is that there really is nothing going on for these two outcomes. Whether you look at a heterogeneous treatment effect function or the marginal effects, there just seems to be no effect of neighborhood policing on these two outcomes. We do see this effect on proactive arrests. They seem to reduce proactive arrests by 10 per precinct per month. Okay, but we can also look at whether these effects are heterogeneous, right? And remember to take these results with caution because of the results we saw from the simulation, where it was a little bit more difficult to get the nominal coverage rates of the heterogeneous treatment effect functions. But what we see is that for each covariate, unemployment is the only one that we see sort of something substantial come up. And what we see with this negative estimate for unemployment is interpreted as that higher levels of unemployment lead to bigger reductions in proactive arrests, which I think does make some sense intuitively. If you have higher levels of unemployment, you have more people kind of wandering around on the streets that are more likely to be affected by police officers' discretionary arrests, these proactive arrests for these low-level nonviolent offenses, right? So it may make sense that the effect size will be bigger in those precincts, right? But again, take these results with caution. We saw that their coverage was not always at the nominal level from the simulation study. Now, I will be clear is that here, I only looked 3 time points in the future. And when we only looked 3 time points in the future, our coverage was much better. But still, just interpret with caution, but it might be something to sort of pursue for future study. All right, so just to wrap up, so we printed this approach to sort of estimating the causal effects in these staggered adoption settings where you have a fair amount of pre-treatment data, right? We relied on that pre-treatment data so that we could model these time series models, this sort of complex high-dimensional time series model. What was nice about doing it with the Bayesian approach is we saw that accounting for uncertainty in those things like the heterogeneous treatment effect functions or any of the other marginal estimates that we were looking at was quite straightforward once we had the posterior distribution of the individual treatment effects. One thing that I was super happy with was that, at least for the 3 outcomes that I looked at here, the simulations on the observed New York City data seemed to indicate that we were able to get good coverage rates for most of the estimands that we're interested in, right? Except for maybe we had some problems with the heterogeneous estimands. But for the average ones, we saw great coverage, close to 95% for nearly all time points that we considered, which gave us a little bit more belief in that our stationarity assumptions, our modeling assumptions are not too unreasonable in this case. So there is a paper up on arXiv. Here's the link to it. Some references are here. But yeah, I'm ready for questions now, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, Joey. This is where we would all applaud if we weren't on Zoom. That was great. Thank you so much. People had to start wandering back to their next meetings, but
That's okay.
are there any questions?
I have a question about the simulation studies you mentioned are like give you confidence in the stationarity assumption, for example. Could you explain which assumptions are testable by that simulation study and which are not?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think, I would say that probably none of them are fully testable, right? So like stationarity is not testable because I need stationarity to hold in the time periods, after treatment is initiated. And what I'm doing with the simulation study is looking at earlier time periods and seeing whether stationarity seems to hold in those cases, right? And I could even do a formal stationarity test that they have in the time series literature if I wanted to, and I might feel better about the fact that it seems to hold, but it may not hold in the future time points when I need it. So I would almost say it's like partially testable. It gives you more belief in that assumption, or at the very least, it can certainly alert you to misspecification or violations of that assumption if you do really poorly. And I didn't have time to talk about this here. I really wanted to, but we didn't have time. Was that there is an outcome that we weren't interested in for the data analysis, but that exhibits a strong amount of non-stationarity. And if you apply this approach, it doesn't work. And the simulation shows you that you get poor coverage. So, it stinks that the model didn't work for that data, but it's nice that you have this way of validating it and seeing that it's not going to give you great results, right? But in terms of the other assumptions, because I'm artificially inducing a treatment time, right, for every precinct, I can't evaluate things like interference, right? So, because there is no other unit that's treated that I can see whether it's affecting somehow, right? I'm artificially starting treatment times and artificially creating the treatment effects. So there's no way for me to evaluate interference or the anticipatory effects assumptions. Yeah, so I guess nothing is actually perfectly testable, right? But you get some hope that things work out a little bit better. You do that.
I would think that your stationarity test would suggest like whether the underlying trends are stationary, and then again, what you have to worry about is just, does something change? Maybe this is an empty statement, but it tells you that there is a stationary process, and then the question is, did that stationary process end and get replaced with something else? And you would probably have subject matter knowledge about whether that happened.
Yeah. No, I think everything you said is right. And yeah, I mean, we'd hope that we'd have some subject matter knowledge on this stuff, and so I'd revert to Brendan on that. But I mean, it's hard to say. I think one thing that is nice and I think you were hinting at this earlier with why it might be nice, the staggered adoption setting is good, is that, if you have, maybe at a particular point in time, you're trying to forecast for a few precincts into the future, right? But you're still observing a lot of control time series through other precincts, right? If there's a big shock to the system that affects all of New York City, you observe that in those counterfactual, in the control time series. And if your model is done in a nice way where you let, there's spatial correlation. So we're letting the predictions for a particular precinct do depend on what happens in those other control time series. So if there's a really big shift, and actually I think you can see it in the data, some of our pre-treatment data, there's like, I wish I had these axes labeled better, but there's a couple points where, you can see that it really drops in one time period. So, and all of the little gray things dropped, right? It's not just the average drop, but like something probably happened in New York City in that month, right? And if I was trying to forecast in that period, my model for a particular precinct may not work, but the fact that I observe all these other precincts where I observe that change is going to help me out. Right?
Yeah, it makes me think that actually what you probably have to worry about is precincts self-selecting into a particular treatment time because they're aware of a precinct-specific exogenous shock or something.
Yeah, like we're starting the treatment now because this thing's about to happen. And so then
I don't know how realistic that is, but I I guess that's the form of confounding that you would have to worry about in this setting.
Yeah, it's kind of like, it's like almost confounding and almost like a simultaneous treatment, right? If something happens kind of simultaneous to the treatment initiation, then I can't differentiate those two things.
Yeah.
And I'll incorrectly attribute it to, neighborhood policing instead of it being something else.
Any other questions?
Okay, if there's no more questions, we can just thank Joey again for the presentation. And we'll see you next time. For the next seminar is the 22nd at 12:15.
And thanks everybody for coming. Sorry, before everyone leaves, I just want to say thanks. The questions were great. I was really happy to be here. And thanks, Dan, for the clapping of you can apparently clap through Zoom. I'm now realizing you can put a clap hand sign up, which I didn't realize.
You got some appreciation in the chat too, as people had to sign off.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it. It was fun.
All right. Thank you, Joey.
Yeah, hopefully see you guys in person sometime soon,
Yep, that would be great.
Yeah. All right, take care, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.